Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Hannah Thompson, and I'm a Senior Associate with Protectnon Consulting Group. And with me today, I have Leilani and Claire, who will introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Leilani Elliott. I'm co-founder and senior partner of Protectnon Consulting Group and one of the co-authors of this piece.
Hello, I'm Claire Whiting, a Senior Associate with Protectnon and a co-author of this report on child neglect.
So this webinar today is organised by the Child Protection Minimum Standards of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. The purpose of the webinar is to summarise the key findings and highlight the recommendations of the recently published report that Leilani and Claire co-authored. Report's called Child Neglect in Humanitarian Settings, Literature Review and Recommendations for Strengthening Prevention and Response. The hope is that by presenting a clear definition of child neglect applicable to humanitarian settings and drawing attention to actions that may address neglect, the report and this webinar will help frontline workers to be better able to identify situations of neglect, determine the risk factors for neglect, and therefore provide appropriate preventive and responsive services that support child resilience and family, community, and societal level responses that enable healthy child development. So Claire, would you like to tell us a bit about why there is a focus now on child neglect in humanitarian settings?
Available data globally shows that amongst violence, abuse, exploitation and neglect is actually neglect that's the most common form of child maltreatment. And in fact, neglect is the leading cause of death in child maltreatment cases. I think over the last 1 or 2 years, a number of actors in the child protection in humanitarian settings context have begun to realise that neglect was really being overlooked. With the current process, the ongoing process for the child protection minimum standards revision, it was really a really important point in time to ensure that neglect is fully considered and included going forward.
So Leilani, can you give us a bit of background specifically about the report and how you carried out the research, what methods you used, etc.?
The research was undertaken primarily as a first step to assess the state of existing data and evidence on prevalence and trends relating to neglect in humanitarian settings, to identify any good practice in terms of prevention, mitigation and response, to identify any knowledge gaps, and to propose recommendations moving forwards on how neglect could or should be included in the revised CPMS and in child protection programming. So we began by collating and reviewing legal, academic and grey literature and statistics. It's basically a desk review, looking at defining neglect and how information on the nature, scale and forms of neglect that children experience globally is presented in those different documents.
So were there any challenges in trying to understand what neglect is and the scale of neglect that's been experienced by children in humanitarian settings themselves?
Absolutely, there were. To date, there's been very little consensus about how neglect is defined and how to measure it, especially in humanitarian settings, which often occur in countries which prior to the crisis already had poor infrastructure or weak government or pre-existing levels of extreme poverty and deprivation. Separating or teasing out the distinction between widespread deprivation and neglect and setting that threshold has been something that's quite difficult, and not a lot of research has been done on that. Another issue that was quite a challenge is that a lot of the available data that is specifically on neglect has come from the global north, and none has come directly from humanitarian contexts. So for humanitarian settings, we relied to some extent on proxy indicators, looking at extreme poverty, school attendance, health, nutrition and protection indicators.
So can you clarify for us how the report defines child neglect, given you both, Claire and yourself, touched on the fact that it was quite complicated to establish what child neglect is?
You know, globally there were some subtleties in the way that neglect is defined, and you know there are different ways it's defined in a legal criminal justice system or in a social work setting. And what we're looking for is how it would apply specifically in a humanitarian context. And the working definition is that neglect is the failure of a caregiver being any person, community, or institution, including the state, with a clear responsibility to protect a child from actual or potential harm, to fulfil that child's right to survival, development, and well-being. The other thing that's really important about this definition, and again, coming from a very child-centred approach, is that it focuses on the impact of the child. So it's recognising that children may be unintentionally neglected or harmed by their caregivers, and it's not looking at stigmatising caregivers. It recognises that children may be harmed by caregivers who have the best of intentions. They simply may lack the required abilities, financial capacities, knowledge and resources to care for their children. They may actively seek out support, and that support may not be available. They may be denied that support. They may be denied that support for discriminatory reasons. There may be denial of humanitarian access. The state may simply be overwhelmed and not be in a position to provide that support. The infrastructure doesn't exist. So it's very much aimed at supporting caregivers to look after and provide care and support and protection for children. But at the same time, recognising that our primary responsibility is the best interests of the child.
And to be clear, a caregiver is not only someone who's directly living with a child, filling the parental role, be it biological, foster care, etc. It's a wider term than that.
Exactly. So again, drawing on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, a caregiver does not have to be a biological or even an adoptive or foster parent. It's any person with a legal or professional responsibility to care for a child, either permanently or temporarily. So this could be someone in a parental capacity, but it could also be the personnel of an institution, such as a teacher, a workplace employee. It covers child protection actors, it covers animators in a CFS, and it covers state actors, because ultimately the state is responsible for children without parental care. The state is responsible for children who are institutionalised, whether it's in a juvenile justice facility, in a medical facility. There are many instances where the state is ultimately responsible for the child's care.
Okay. Claire, could you tell us a bit about what the different forms of neglect are?
So the six categories that can either occur on their own or perhaps simultaneously at the same time in any case of child neglect are, first of all, physical neglect. So that's a failure to provide a child or the failure to protect a child from harm or to fulfill a child's right to their basic necessities, including adequate food, shelter, clothing, or basic medical care. And then medical neglect, which refers to a failure to seek timely and appropriate medical care for a serious physical or mental health problem. Emotional neglect, which is a form of neglect that we quite commonly associate with the generic term neglect, and particularly when we talk about younger children, which is a failure to provide a child with regular emotional attention, nurture, and opportunities for development and enrichment. And this includes that serve and return dynamic that is so important in early childhood between a primary caregiver and a child. But emotional neglect also includes exposing a child to intimate partner violence or drug or alcohol abuse. And then we have educational neglect, which is more straightforward perhaps in terms of identification and response as well. So a failure to secure a child's education through attendance at a school or another appropriate learning opportunity. We have supervisory neglect, a failure to provide an appropriate environment with appropriate adult, age-appropriate adult supervision, thereby potentially placing a child at risk of harm. And finally, the final subset of neglect is abandonment, so the failure of a caregiver to maintain contact with a child or to provide reasonable support for a specified period of time.
It sounds like it covers quite a wide range of different forms, the broader term neglect. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what those different forms have in terms of impact upon children's well-being and development.
neglect can cause both immediate, gradual, and cumulative or dose effect negative impacts on a range of outcomes across a child's lifespan, that impacts that can extend into adulthood. So, for example, on physical development and health, on neural and cognitive development, and on later mental health and well-being. So like specific examples of impacts would be development delays, stunted growth, chronic medical issues, impaired neurological development, and reduced cognitive capacity throughout a lifetime potentially. In the most severe cases, neglect can be life-threatening, and neglected children can die from injury, exposure to unsafe environments, starvation, or the failure of a caregiver to protect them from illness or malnutrition that arises from neglect. But whilst the potential impacts are very wide, the impact of neglect on any individual child is dependent on quite a wide range of factors. So the age and development stage of a child, the type of neglect that we discussed above, the form of neglect that occurred, the intensity, the frequency, the duration of neglect, how long this specific circumstance has been going on for in a child's life, the age they were when it started, for example, the child's own resilience and their personal characteristics that can help them manage the scenarios that they find themselves in or not, and the wider social systems that the child lives in, so the protective and the risk factors that exist within their lives. I think it's really important to recognise that whilst all children are and can be vulnerable to neglect, that babies and young children are particularly at risk if they experience neglect, because the first years, the early years of a child's life have a big impact on how their brains develop, and an environment that meets the basic needs and provides stimulation as well as the consistent presence of a nurturing caregiver are critical to the neural development, the brain development, and their later well-being.
And so do these impacts, the impacts of neglect, change in humanitarian settings?
Anecdotal evidence suggests that neglect increases the vulnerability of children to other risks, to other forms of maltreatment, but also to negative coping strategies. So, for example, a disruption to family or emotional support, or insufficient supplies to meet basic needs, or a lack of age-appropriate supervision may have secondary child protection implications or act as drivers for a child to engage in negative coping strategies such as transactional sex, exploitative labour, maybe early marriage, for example. And children in these situations can be easier targets for trafficking, for recruitment into armed forces, or for sexual exploitation and abuse. So I think that we make an assumption, but we don't yet have the data to suggest that humanitarian crises actually could potentially see a higher rate of prevalence of child neglect than non-humanitarian contexts.
You've both mentioned risk and protective factors a number of times. Leilani, do you want to tell us a bit more about risk factors and how they may increase the chance of a child being neglected, I guess especially in humanitarian settings, if we've got any evidence on that?
So we typically look at risk factors and protective factors within a socio-ecological framework, starting with the child and then fanning outwards within the child's broader environment. For children themselves, individual risk factors include innate characteristics such as age, sex, and disability. So as Claire mentioned, that would include younger children, typically girls, children with disabilities or complex health needs, and children with poor adaptive capacity would typically be more vulnerable to neglect. Separated and unaccompanied children, so children whose parents or primary caregivers are missing, dislocated, displaced, deceased, also face a greater risk of neglect, as do children living with foster parents or extended family or in other sorts of alternative care arrangements. Another factor that has an impact on children's vulnerability to neglect are the characteristics and situations of their primary caregivers. So where parents or caregivers are single, are living with a disability or chronic illness, lack parenting skills, are themselves survivors of child neglect or another form of child maltreatment, such as violence, exploitation or abuse, are suffering alcohol or substance abuse disorders, are suffering intimate partner violence. This impedes their ability to provide safe and responsive care. And if we think about this in the context of a humanitarian crisis, things become that much more difficult. Even caregivers who would normally provide stable, nurturing care often find themselves in situations of displacement, threatened livelihoods, acute poverty, food insecurity, and these things deprive them of not only the physical resources to fill children's basic needs, such as adequate food, water, shelter, clothing, medical care, but also the emotional resources to engage in responsive parenting, caregiving and cognitive stimulation. On top of this, there are situations caregivers become injured, fall ill, become separated from their children, or are simply completely overwhelmed by their own emotions, and again, unable to meet children's physical, emotional or psychological needs.
Can you tell us a bit about the other levels of the socio-ecological framework that you were mentioning? So what the risk factors are present at the community and society level and how these may increase the chance of a child experiencing neglect?
Yeah, at the community level, the biggest risk factors for households, for parents, caregivers, and at the household level, are social isolation and the breakdown of traditional community structures. And this is certainly not uncommon during humanitarian crises. We often see the disintegration of informal community groups and social networks, such as religious associations, school clubs, women's groups, and extended families. And this can leave caregivers and children without broader support to draw on and other networks to tap into for support. And then once we reach society level risk factors, we're heading more into the realm of development than humanitarian action. We're looking at issues like poor governance, weak institutions, widespread poverty, state fragility, regimes marked by human rights violations and repression, and low levels of socioeconomic development. And so in many instances, children in these situations will have been experiencing neglect prior to the humanitarian crisis, and the situation, once the crisis hits, will exponentially worsen. There may be infrastructure damage, population displacement, further weakening of government capacity, a denial of humanitarian access. And all of this may work to prevent the access of families and of children to basic services and institutions that would normally support children's safety, development and well-being, or they may hinder and further weaken the functioning of these basic services and institutions.
Yeah, so I'm guessing it looks like the person responsible for the neglect then isn't necessarily always the family, right? Sometimes it's other state actors or institutions or even humanitarian actors that are neglecting to address children's needs.
Exactly. So when we start looking at how child protection actors can respond, there are different levels. You know, we can work with children, we can work with families, we can work with communities. But when it comes to addressing these broader society level issues, it's got into the realm of advocacy, state building, system strengthening, and working very closely with development partners to support the government in resuming its responsibility as the ultimate duty bearer responsible for the fulfilment of children's rights. So that's starting to get beyond the remit of day-to-day child protection programming.
So how do you think child protection actors can improve the way that we're addressing neglect in humanitarian settings now that we have this information that's come from this report?
So in the report, we outline 4 main areas of recommendations. And so as a child protection community, in terms of moving forward, we really need to, first of all, build a strong evidence base. We need to make neglect more visible in individual and joint assessments, for example, include it in the child protection information management system, not only as neglect as an overall category, but those subcategories of neglect that we covered earlier. We need to work with all stakeholders, including other sectors, to better identify, mitigate, and prevent neglect. And then finally, we really need to respond more systematically and put in place the tools and the systems that will enable us to respond more systematically when neglect is identified. Obviously, this is a really broad set of recommendations, and each of these main areas are broken down into detailed recommendations in the report. So, for example, in terms of building the evidence base, we need to build the evidence base in terms of data collection on neglect by type of neglect, by different type of humanitarian setting, in different phases of emergency, as it affects different cohorts of children, so girls, boys, infants, young children, older children, etc. And also in terms of effective prevention, mitigation, and response to neglect in humanitarian settings specifically.
As we mentioned, what we want to do is see neglect mainstreamed throughout the minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action, and potentially see a dedicated standard on neglect in the CPMS, where currently there is none.
We do hope this discussion has given you some ideas on some of the actions that you can take in your work, specifically to address neglect, to mitigate against, prevent and respond to it across all humanitarian settings. And that we hope that you'll be tempted to read the full report, where you'll see a lot more details on the various forms of neglect, the impact it can have on children's lives, and the different actions that we recommend taking based on the evidence that does exist, as Claire and Leilani highlighted, not primarily from humanitarian settings, but that might be applicable and adaptable to those settings. So thank you, Claire and Leilani, for giving some food for thought on specific ways in which we can ensure we act on neglect in humanitarian settings.